My dear listeners, gather round the warmth of a fire, because today I am going to take you through one of the most turbulent and complex periods in history. This is the story of the Fourth Crusade, a campaign that started with noble intentions and ended in moral collapse. But take your time. There is much more to this story than you think. It's not your usual heroic tale. It's about betrayal, greed, political gamesmanship, and the destruction of a city to the point of being erased from history. In the beginning, the purpose of the Crusades was holy, wasn't it? To take back the Holy Land from the Muslims, to show the power of faith. But things don't always go as intended. Sometimes that intention merges with the darker desires within, and history becomes a tragedy rather than a glorious epic. And that is exactly how this story began, with big dreams, but with a campaign that turned out to be much more complicated. In those days, Europe was boiling all over, from the Holy Roman Empire to the rich lands of France, to the colorful cities of Italy. The Crusades were on everyone's lips. But my dear friends, the Fourth Crusade was different from the others, because this crusade was not only won with swords and shields, but also with gold, silver, and political games. It was a war of interests rather than a crusade of faith. Before we begin our story, close your eyes for a moment. Think about it. You are on the streets of Europe in the dark and turbulent times of the Middle Ages. The huge bells of the churches are calling the Christian people to war. The Pope's call echoes in your ears. The Holy Land awaits us. Nobles, peasants, warriors, all are gathering to answer this holy call. But we can't help asking the question, were they really going to war for faith alone? Or are there other desires behind the scenes? So, my friends, are you ready to find out how this campaign began? Let's take a journey back to those moments when the Pope's call echoed, when the whole of Europe was abuzz with excitement. What exactly sparked this campaign, and what promises did the armies that set out from Europe fall for? Dear listeners, I am going to tell you a story, but this story goes beyond mere battles, swords, and victories. It goes deep into a world shaped by human hopes, fears, and desires. Let's go back in time to the First Crusades to understand the roots of this campaign, to understand what kind of storm it foreshadowed. Because in order to understand the First Crusade, it is necessary to know the first steps of this adventure. In those days, Europe was going through a dark period. It was the late 11th century, and the Christian world was fragmented. Western Europe was divided between small kingdoms and fiefdoms, and the people were living in poverty. Nevertheless, the church was strong. The church was not only interested in saving souls, but also in controlling lands and thrones. It was at this point that Pope Urbanus II made his famous appeal. The Holy Land must be liberated from the Muslims. People from all over Western Europe saw the Pope's call as a hope for salvation. Nobles dreamed of new lands and riches, while peasants joined the crusade to save their souls and win heaven. The First Crusade began with great enthusiasm and ended with the capture of Jerusalem. But, my friends, In the shadow of every victory lies a disaster. Jerusalem was taken, but the Christian kingdoms in the region were weakened by constant Muslim attacks. Thus the road was paved for the second, third, and finally the fourth crusade. But why were the other crusades not successful? Ah, my dear friends, this is where the immutable nature of mankind comes into play. Betrayals, weak leadership, and individual ambitions have largely led to the failure of these campaigns. The Second Crusade, for example, was a disappointment. The armies dispersed before reaching their goal. The Third Crusade seemed like an epic adventure with big names like King Richard, but it failed to achieve its main objective, the recapture of Jerusalem. Each failure made the need for a new expedition even greater. What about the situation in Europe? The Crusades were not just a religious issue. In fact, the economic and political conditions of the time also shaped the emergence of these campaigns. Europe had become a place with a rapidly growing population, but limited resources. Landowners were looking for new land, and young knights were seeking adventure and riches. At the same time, trading powers like the Italian city-states of Venice and Genoa were looking for ways to reap huge economic gains from these campaigns. Ah, my friends, remember this. No event arises from a single cause. What began as religious fervor became an economic and political tool. And it was this mixture that distinguished the Fourth Crusade from the others. Now, this crusade would not only target the Holy Lands, it would take a completely different turn. But what were the first signs of this deviation? What promises, what bargains contaminated this holy cause? We will find the answers to these questions in the call of Pope Innocentius III and in the shadow of Venice. Are you ready, dear friends? Then in the next chapter, let us witness the first steps of this dark journey. Dear listeners, in the previous episode, I brought you to the brink of a dark age. Now I will tell you the birth of one of the most complicated crusades in the history of mankind. Get ready, because this is a story of ambitions, intrigues, and desperate hopes that spilled beyond the Holy Land. We are going back to the time when the Fourth Crusade was declared. The year is 1198. The Christian world was still mourning the capture of Jerusalem by Saladin Ayyubi in 1187. Jerusalem, that holy city. It was not just a piece of land, but for Christianity, it was the key to heaven. But that key was now in the hands of the enemy. This shook the leaders of the church in Europe. And in this turmoil, there was a new leader rising at the head of the church, Pope Innocentius III. Pope Innocentius III was a young, determined leader who wanted to make the power of the church felt in every field. His aim was not only to liberate Jerusalem, but also to reassert the authority of the church in Europe. The Pope sent letters all over Europe calling for a new crusade. These letters were literally invitations to war. The Pope promised both heaven and earthly glory, he said. But, my friends, this call was not just a religious message. The Pope's words echoed like a song of salvation in the ears of the desperate. Peasants dispossessed of their land, knights in debt, young leaders seeking a greater destiny, all looked to this expedition as a gateway to hope. and the Pope's message was addressed not only to individuals but also to kingdoms. He wanted this crusade to be under the control of the Church. In previous crusades, rivalries between leaders had led to failures. This time, the Pope planned to create a disciplined army under the control of the Church itself. Of course, my friends, the motivations for this crusade were not only holy. Those who answered the Pope's call had their eyes on much more than Jerusalem. New lands, new spoils, and new titles. That's human nature. Self-interest is always part of the story, no matter how noble the cause. But the Pope's desire to keep all these ambitions in check would create problems for how the expedition would be directed. And what about the real purpose of the expedition? Jerusalem. That was the heart of it all. Bringing Jerusalem back into the hands of the Christian world was both a religious and a political victory for the Pope. But did you know that this goal faced a major problem right from the start, because the resources and logistics needed to get to Jerusalem were almost impossible for the fractured leaders of Europe. And it was at this point that the negotiations that began in the shadow of this sacred mission would turn the expedition in a completely different direction. Dear listeners, in this story you will see the tension between sacred goals and worldly interests. The Fourth Crusade was plunged into great contradictions before it even began. And how would these contradictions take shape? What secret deals and what opportunities would make this crusade controversial throughout history? In the next episode, we will explore the darker side of this story. Are you ready? My dear listeners, as the call of Pope Innocentius III echoed across Europe, the steps of the multitudes who vowed to unite for a holy cause were being taken down the cruel paths of fate. But it's easy to dream. Building an army, financing it, and getting it ready for campaigning, well, all this is always the most difficult challenge. Even when you are pursuing a holy cause, I now take you into the complexities of these preparations. We will see how what started as a wave of hope turned into a knot that was difficult to untie. As the Pope's letters spread, different leaders, knights, and ordinary people from all over Europe were mobilized by the desire to join the expedition. Knights began sharpening the swords in their hands. Peasants dreamed of the miraculous transformations they hoped for during the campaign. But, my friends, this diversity also meant a host of problems. For instead of being led by a king or a single powerful leader, this expedition was about to become a hodgepodge of independent nobles and knights, each with different ambitions, goals, and expectations. There was a leadership vacuum at the head of the army. Great kings hesitated after the failures of past campaigns. For example, King Philippe Augustus of France and King Richard the Lionheart of England refused to take part in the renewed campaign after the defeats and losses they had suffered in the Third Crusade. Leadership was therefore left to local nobles, less powerful figures. Among the participants in the expedition were important figures such as Boniface of Montferrat, a charismatic and experienced leader, but not a king. The participants of the expedition therefore lacked a unified command, which led to great difficulties from the first days of planning. While the gathering of the army was one thing, an even bigger problem was waiting at the door: financing. My dear listeners, money is always the key, even for a holy war. Armor, horses, supplies, and ships, all of these require gold. But for the Crusaders, this campaign started with a financial disaster. Many of them were already swimming in their own debts, and the church was literally unable to fund the expedition. The Pope's great appeal unfortunately lacked the necessary financial infrastructure. This is where Venice's trade networks and powerful navy entered the scene. Venice. Under the mask of aid offered in the name of a holy mission, this merchant city-state actually had its own vested interests. The Crusaders made a deal with Venice. Venice would transport the Crusader army on its ships to the Holy Land. But there was a price, dear listeners, and it was a very high price. The Crusader army agreed to lend Venice 8,500 silver marks. However, this was not enough gold to fill Venice's coffers full of wealth, because the Crusaders could not afford it. When the armies arrived in Venice, arriving with high hopes from all over Europe, they faced a big problem. They could not raise the money needed for the ships that would provide their transportation. Enrico Dandolo, Doge of Venice, was torn between anger and opportunity at this unexpected situation. But Venice was a state that knew the art of trade. Dandolo proposed a solution to help the Crusaders pay their debts: attack the city of Zara, Venice's rival. My dear friends, think now, how could an army on its way to liberate Jerusalem agree to attack another Christian city in order to protect Venice's commercial interests? This is where the direction of the campaign took a completely different turn. The attack on the damage not only changed the course of the Crusaders, but also profoundly shook the sacred nature of the expedition. And here I stop, dear listeners, because there is a continuation of this story, darker and full of unexpected developments. And how do you think Venice's dark plans will lead the Crusaders to their doom? In the next episode, we will explore the most surprising and controversial moments of the Fourth Crusade. Are you ready? Dear listeners, I take you now to one of history's greatest ironies. An army of Crusaders, on their way to liberate the Holy Land, decided to attack a Christian city inhabited by their own co-religionists. Here is Zara's story, a dark period that reveals how the expedition deviated from its goals and how it suffered a moral collapse. The plan of Enrico Dandolo, Doge of Venice, was not only clever but also ruthless. Venice was a city-state looking for opportunities to expand its trading empire. And here was an army of crusaders, unable to pay their debts, writhing in despair. Dandolo did not hesitate to turn the situation in his favor. "If you want to go to Jerusalem," he told the Crusader leaders, "take care of us first, conquer the city of Zara, and pay your debt." Zara was a shining star of the Adriatic Sea at that time. An important port city on the trade routes, Zara had long been a rival of Venice. However, my dear friends, this city was in Christian territory, and its people were of the same faith. Here, the holy nature of the crusade faced a great dilemma. Sacking another Christian city on the way to Jerusalem. How could this be acceptable? But what does desperation make you do? The Crusaders knew that they could not reach the Holy Land without the ships and support of Venice. Their only option was to accept Dandolo's offer, and so they set sail for Zara. From that moment on, the religious objectives of this expedition gave way to commercial and political calculations. as the siege of Zara began, do you think the prayers rising from the city walls resonated in the consciences of the Crusaders? Who knows? But these prayers were lost in the din of battle. The people of Zara tried to maintain their defense to the end, but the army they faced was not only on a religious mission, but also full of greed and desperation. The city soon fell, and the Crusaders began to loot. The streets of Zara, once a peaceful trade route, are now a flaming battlefield. But, dear friends, the repercussions of this sack were not felt only in Zara. When news reached Rome, Pope Innocentius III was furious. Having declared the crusade a holy mission, he saw the attack on a Christian city as a great betrayal. After the fall of Zara, the Pope threatened the Crusader leaders with excommunication. "You have defiled your holy mission," the Pope's letters said. But, alas, there was no turning back the expedition from that point. The sack of Zara called into question not only the legitimacy of the crusade, but also the faith and commitment of its participants. Dandolo's plan had turned the Crusaders into pawns for Venetian interests. My dear listeners, at this point it is necessary to pause and reflect. If the nature of a mission can be so easily perverted, how sacred can it remain? But the story does not end here now. The fall of Zara was only the beginning. And what dark paths did the Crusaders take after that? In the shadow of Venice, another tragedy was approaching, one that would go down in history. What would be the consequences of the steps taken by the participants of this expedition into the heart of Byzantium? Wait and see, my dear friends. My friends, this point in history was a tangled knot of not only intrigue, but also betrayal and despair. The Byzantine Empire was weaker than one would expect from a great empire at that time, rotting from within. Behind the palace walls, fights for the throne were raging and intrigues were flying. This was the beginning of a story that would affect not only the people of the empire itself, but also the Crusaders of the time. In sitting on the Byzantine throne was Isaacos Angelos II. But dear listeners, sitting on the throne does not always mean being safe. Isaacos was treacherously deposed by his own brother. Alexius IV coveted his brother's throne, locked him in a dungeon for the blind, and declared himself ruler of Byzantium. But fate, ironically, would bring not only this brotherly betrayal to the stage, but also the intervention of an outside power. In the midst of this turmoil, the young and ambitious Alexius Angelos, son of Isaac II, who had lost his throne, appeared. Seeking to reclaim his father's rights and salvage his own legacy, Alexei took a decision that would bind him not only to the Byzantine court, but to the fate of all of Europe. The young Alexei set his sights on the Crusader army. This army, which had sacked Zara and paid its debts to Venice, but had failed to make its way to the holy city of Jerusalem, became his hope. And here, my dear friends, history once again showed how money and promises can trump sacred ideals. Alexei made a bold offer to the Crusader leaders. "Help me reclaim my father's throne," he said, "and in return I will offer you gold, soldiers, and all the resources of Byzantium. Moreover, we will declare our allegiance to the Catholic Church." To the Crusader leaders, this offer sounded like the opening of a new door to the conquest of Jerusalem. But this door was a door to the heart of Byzantium. At this point, the influence of Enrico Dandolo, Doge of Venice, should not be forgotten. Dandolo wanted to exploit Byzantium's weakness for his own commercial ambitions. Alexi's proposal fit perfectly into his plans. The Crusaders became pawns in a political game rather than a religious mission. And so, the Crusader army was directed towards Byzantium. My dear friends, the goal of this expedition was no longer the Holy Jerusalem, but the palaces of the Byzantine throne. Although the Crusaders did not fully understand the implications of this decision, they were mobilized by the riches and support promised by Alexei. This army against the palace walls would change the political balance not only in the empire, but also in Europe and Asia. But I ask you this, could Alexei's promises really be fulfilled? Would the Crusaders be able to understand the complex internal politics of Byzantium, or would this city be the site of another tragedy that would be etched in history? Let's meet in the next episode to find out the answer to this question, dear friends. Let's see in which hands the fate of Byzantium will be shaped. My friends, I will now tell you of those confusing times when Constantinople was surrounded by shadows, when fear and hope hung in the air at the same time. The city was still majestic with its golden domes, and its walls had withstood centuries of attacks. But this time, it was not only the enemy that was at its gates, but the ghosts of Byzantium's own mistakes. In the summer of 1203, the Crusaders and the Venetian Armada crossed the blue waters of the Sea of Marmara and arrived in front of Constantinople. The Crusader leaders marched with the rewards promised by the young Alexius Angelos in mind. Even as they stood before the city's magnificent walls, they were filled with the conviction of victory. But this magnificent city was not about to surrender so easily. The Crusaders' first siege had been carefully planned. The soldiers disembarked from the ships and searched for weak points in the walls. The defenders of Constantinople massed on the walls, determined to protect their city. The sky filled with the echoes of clashing swords and arrows. The Byzantines were proud to defend their own land, but behind the Crusaders were the oaths and promises of young Alexei to his father. The Crusaders failed to breach the walls in a few days, but the unrest in the city became their greatest ally. The people did not trust the current emperor, Alexius IV. The young Alexius Angelos had made a deal with the Crusaders that he would reclaim his father's throne. The weight of this agreement darkened the fate of the Byzantine Empire. Eventually, the city's defenders gave in, and Alexei the Younger entered the city amid cries of victory. His father, Isaacos Angelos, was brought out of the dungeons and restored to his throne. The people were hopeful at first. Perhaps this young ruler could make Byzantium strong again. But my friends, history teaches us this: promised salvation does not always bring peace. Alexei found it difficult to fulfill his promises to the Crusaders. His father's treasury had been emptied by years of wars and internal strife. When he tried to collect the gold to pay the Crusaders from the people through taxation, this inflamed the anger of the people. Unable to trust even their own ruler, the people now openly regarded Alexei and his foreign allies as enemies. Unrest was growing in the city, and the people were inclined to revolt. Constantinople had turned into a boiling cauldron. Alexius Angelos and his father Isakokios came under increasing pressure. The Crusaders, for their part, were impatient and angry because they had not received their reward and promises had not been fulfilled. And this confusion, my friends, soon turned into tragedy. The people saw the Crusaders as wretched marauders and enemies. The Crusaders, driven by frustration and anger, began to act more aggressively to protect their own interests. Constantinople was once again thrown into turmoil and dragged into a new drama on the stage of history. But, my friends, at this point I ask you, to what would the anger of the people and the impatience of the Crusaders lead Constantinople? Was this glorious city preparing to witness the greatest betrayal in its history? Ah, my friends, here we are approaching one of the most shocking and tragic moments in history. Constantinople, hidden under golden domes, was once the heart of the East. From this city rose the light of culture, science, and faith. But now that glorious city was about to fall into the clutches of darkness, shadowed by greed and treachery. In the fateful spring of 1204, the Crusaders were once again at the gates of Constantinople. After the first siege, unrest, struggles for the throne, and popular anger swept the city like a storm. There was another change on the throne. Alexius IV was deposed and replaced by Emperor Alexius V, known as tumultuous. But this new emperor had further raised the anger of the Crusaders by rejecting the treaties with the Crusaders. War trumpets were sounded again and swords were sharpened once more. The Crusaders' second siege was far more brutal, far more deadly. This time it was not just a struggle for gold or the throne, but for survival and revenge. Ships were brought closer to the walls. Catapults began to spew death. The majestic walls of the city were barriers that no enemy had been able to breach for centuries. But alas, this time treachery from within had weakened their strength. When the city finally fell, Constantinople awoke to one of the darkest days in its history. When the Crusader army entered the city, it showed no respect for any value, neither sacred nor human. The Hagia Sophia, famous for its golden domes, was transformed from a sacred place of worship into a place of looting. Icons were smashed, mosaics decorated with precious stones were dismantled, and sacred objects were looted. The hymns echoing off the walls of the churches were replaced by wailing. Palaces and the homes of the people suffered the same fate. Women, children, and the elderly suffered the pain of this tragedy. By the time the people realized that the Crusaders had come, not to save them but to destroy them, it was too late. The riches of the city were loaded onto ships to be transported to Europe. Even today, some of the artifacts in the great cathedrals of the West are treasures stolen from Constantinople in those tragic days. This looting was not just physical destruction, my friends. These barbaric acts of the Crusaders deepened the divide between the East and the West of Christianity. These two worlds, once defenders of the same faith, were now enemies. The Crusades had begun as a religious mission, but the sack of Constantinople painfully demonstrated how far they had strayed from their spiritual purpose. But my friends, let us pause and think. What has changed as the result of this sack? My dear listeners, as we come to this turbulent turning point in history, we stand on the threshold of a new era that began with the fall of Constantinople. The pride of Byzantium, with its dazzling domes, palaces, and wealth, was now in the hands of the Crusaders. But the questions that follow victories on the battlefield are always more challenging. What now? In those dark days of 1204, the walls of Constantinople were shattered and the heart of the Holy City plundered. The Crusaders felt entitled to decide the fate of this ancient capital. With the city sacked, it was time for a new order to be established. And so, what Western Europe had dreamed of for centuries became a reality. On the ruins of the Byzantine Empire, a Western-controlled empire, the Latin Empire, was born. The Latin Empire was headed by a powerful and influential figure of those days, Count Baudouin of Flanders. Yes, Baudouin. Some call him a hero, others call him the bearer of the dagger in the heart of Byzantium. When Baudouin was crowned as the first leader of this new empire, the eyes of Europe were on him. But dear friends, this crown was neither a symbol of victory or a harbinger of a long peace. Let us now take a little step back and try to understand the events that laid the foundations of this Latin Empire. After the capture of Constantinople, the Crusader leaders and the Venetians set about dividing the vast Byzantine territories among themselves. Each wanted to be part of this new order and claim its riches. Small states were established on the former Byzantine territory, from Thrace to Greece, from the Aegean Islands to the Peloponnese. Every corner of this new order was influenced by Western Europe. But dear listeners, how strong can an empire built in such haste be? The Latin rulers failed to understand the spirit of the Byzantine people. They were alien to the traditions of this ancient land, to the religion and culture of its people. Although they seemed to be united under the umbrella of Christianity, the divide between the Catholic Latins and the Orthodox Byzantines deepened every day. The people began to resent their new masters. Once ruled by their own emperors, these lands were now ruled by foreigners. From its earliest years, the Latin Empire faced economic and military difficulties. As the riches of Constantinople were depleted, the Latin rulers failed to build a system to compensate for the destruction. Moreover, the Byzantine remnants and newly established states in the surrounding area posed a constant threat to the existence of the Latin Empire. The greatest danger would come not from the west, but from the east. Let us now turn our eyes to the horizon, my friends. As this story unfolds, the enemies who want to take advantage of the Latin Empire's weakness will grow stronger and stronger, and the events that will make the rebirth of Byzantium possible will begin. But how will all this take shape? Who will bring about the end of this weakening empire? And how will Byzantium rise again from its own ashes? Let's meet in the next episode to find out. My dear friends, the following episode reveals how not only a crusade but an era was shaped. The Fourth Crusade culminated in the fall of Constantinople, but like all victories, it was heavily overshadowed. The crusade left behind not only destroyed walls, plundered palaces, and a ruined city, it also left deep wounds etched into the soul of history. Imagine, the Orthodox and Catholic worlds were once forged by the same faith, shaped by the words of the same prophet. But the sack of Constantinople completely shattered this brotherhood. The Orthodox people now saw the Catholic West only as a threat. Churches were looted, relics were stolen, even the most sacred Christian icons were transported to Europe as merchandise. These events sowed an unforgettable seed of hatred, not only among the clergy, but also at the deepest level of the people. What did the Western world hope to gain from this expedition? And what did it find? Ah, my friends, a great disappointment. The initial aim of the Crusades was to liberate Jerusalem. But the Fourth Crusade completely deviated from this goal, and a campaign launched in the name of religion eventually turned into a fratricidal war for power and wealth. While the consequences of this campaign were being debated in Europe, many people were saying that the West had lost its soul. The fact that those who had set out on the journey to Jerusalem had sacked a Christian capital was seen as the greatest symbol of the moral decline of the West. But, dear listeners, the Byzantine Empire suffered the greatest impact of this destruction. The loss of Constantinople accelerated the weakening of this ancient empire. The years under the Latin Empire had shrunk the Byzantine territory even further, breaking the resilience of the people. Even with the Latins gone, Byzantium never regained its former glory. After this campaign, the Byzantine Empire slowly dissolved like a patient doomed to die. And so, a powerful storm like the Ottomans would appear on the stage of history to destroy this weakened structure. Dear friends, after the Fourth Crusade, the Western world began to question not only its reputation, but also its leadership in the Christian world. Even in the heart of Europe, this campaign raised the question, what have we done? Did these wars, launched in the name of religion, really have a sacred purpose, or were they merely a reflection of human ambition? And what about Byzantium? Would this land ever rise again? Or would the failures of the Latin Empire lead this ancient civilization to total destruction? Oh, my dear friends, history sometimes hides the greatest tragedies in the most unexpected corners. The Fourth Crusade left its mark on one of these corners and left an unforgettable wound in the bosom of the Christian world. When this holy expedition, which initially aimed to reach Jerusalem, ended in Constantinople, not only the city, but also beliefs, ideals, and human dignity were destroyed. Let us now take a closer look at the consequences that emerged in the shadow of this destruction. Think about it, dear friends. Before the Fourth Crusade began, the Christian world was already deeply fractured. Since the Great Schism of 1054, the Orthodox and Catholic churches had been distant from each other, arguing over different doctrines. But the sack of Constantinople turned this rift into an abyss. Catholic crusaders laid siege to a Christian capital, looted the holy places of the Orthodox people, and drove a dagger into the heart of the churches. Golden icons were stolen, holy books burned, and even inside Hagia Sophia, Catholic soldiers with their animals are said to have defied sanctity. These shameful images created an unforgettable hatred of Catholics in the Orthodox world. In the eyes of the Orthodox, the West had become not only an enemy, but a betrayer. The occupation of Constantinople by the Latins was not just a military defeat for the Byzantine Empire, my friends. It was the plundering of the soul of an empire. The riches of the city were carried to the west, while the people were left in squalor. Constantinople, which once boasted of its splendor, art, and culture, was now a ruined city. This weakness of Byzantium was a turning point that prepared the end of the empire. Under the Latin Empire, Byzantine territory was fragmented and weakened. The rivalries among the Byzantine rulers, as well as popular anger against the West, accelerated this decline. It was only a matter of time before a rising power like the Ottomans took advantage of this vacuum. Remember, my friends, the initial aim of the Crusades was to take back the Holy Lands from the Muslims and consolidate the leadership of the Christian world. But with the Fourth Crusade, this goal completely disappeared. The road to Jerusalem now ended in the ruined streets of Constantinople. The West's holy war had turned into a hunt for wealth and a struggle for political gain. In Europe, the results of this campaign were harshly criticized. The question of how those who fight for a holy cause can slaughter their brothers and sisters echoed in the churches and among the people. Not only did the Western world lose its ties with the Orthodox, but it also lost credibility with its own people. The Crusades were no longer seen as an epic of heroism, but as a dark tale of human greed. The results of this campaign, my dear friends, led not only Byzantium, but the entire Christian world to undergo a radical change. The fall of Constantinople severed the ties between East and West, hastened the fall of Byzantium, and sapped the spirit of the Crusades. But you know that history does not end there. Every great fall brings a new rise. But would this ancient city, reduced to rubble by the Latins, ever rise again? And how did this weakness of Byzantium shape the Ottoman Empire, a new power on the stage of history? Ah, my friends, we will seek the answers to these questions together in the next episode. Are you ready to explore the dark corners of history even deeper? Oh, my dear friends, as the smoke of the Fourth Crusade had just cleared, the questions echoing in the castles, palaces, and churches of Europe were endless. Is this really the end? Is there a new hope for the liberation of the Holy Land? But these questions were not only the echo of bitter regret or disappointment. They were also the harbingers of a new strategy for the future, of new aspirations being born. The Fourth Crusade's painful legacy lay not only in the destruction of Constantinople, but also in the re-examination of the Crusader spirit. The failures of the campaign brought with them the necessity for a new campaign. In the process, it was possible to see that the holy purpose of the Crusades had been replaced by self-interest, political calculations, and individual ambitions. For the people of Europe, however, this failure was not an end, but a new beginning. The Fourth Crusade not only weakened the Byzantine Empire, but also shook the political balance in Europe. The West's dreams of domination over the East had created deep fissures in the Christian world. These cracks became both an obstacle and a source of motivation for the planning of new crusades. Having lost the trust of the Orthodox Church, would the Western world be able to make up for these mistakes in the next campaign? The longing for the Holy Land was now on the agenda not only of the churches, but also of the people and kings. This time, however, it was a lesson that previous mistakes should not be repeated. But were lessons really learned? This is one of the great questions that historians are still debating. Dear friends, each of the Crusades carries the legacy of the previous one and is built on completing its shortcomings or repeating its mistakes. The impact of the Fourth Crusade had a huge repercussion in Europe. This reverberation did not lead to a diminished interest in the East. On the contrary, it led to an increase. In palaces and churches, the question, what strategy should we follow for a new crusade, was frequently raised. Some argued that the liberation of Jerusalem was still possible, while others thought that the interests of the West now lay beyond the East. However, there was one fact that everyone agreed on. A new crusade had to be organized, and it had to make amends for the mistakes of the past. History opened the door to a new era after the Fourth Crusade. While the kingdoms of Europe were resolving their internal conflicts, they were also preparing for a new campaign against the East. This time, the churches tried to rally the people into a stronger unity. But would this unity be for a truly holy cause, or for the interests of the West? Dear friends, as the ashes of the Fourth Crusade were cooling, new players and new plans were emerging on the stage of history. So, what kind of story would this new campaign write? Would the idealistic knights and mighty kings of Europe bring peace and justice to the East this time? Or would they once again become slaves to their own ambitions? Oh, my dear friends, when the dust of the Fourth Crusade settled and silence fell on the ashes of Constantinople, not only the people of the time, but also historians centuries later began to discuss the meaning of this tragic event. Now, let us pursue these great questions that echo in the depths of the past. What did the Fourth Crusade really mean? Most historians consider the Fourth Crusade a moral disaster. The initial aim of the crusade was to recapture Jerusalem from the Muslims and unite the Christian world. But this goal was completely forgotten in favor of the economic interests of Venice and the greed for power of the Crusader leaders. The fact that Christians targeted their own brothers and sisters and devastated the Orthodox world has been one of the most criticized aspects of this campaign. Some historians see this action of the Crusaders not only as immoral, but also as a strategic mistake. The rupture of religious and cultural ties between East and West meant that the Christian world was never fully united again. Worse still, this division paved the way for the rise of new powers such as the Ottomans. Historian Stephen Runciman summarizes this by saying that the greatest failure of the Crusades was that they so profoundly contaminated Christian ideals. Today, historians view the Fourth Crusade not only as a military failure, but also as a symbol of Western influence over the East. The sack of Constantinople is seen as a demonstration of what the Western world would do for its economic and political interests. After this campaign, Byzantium never regained its former glory and disappeared from the stage of history as a weakened empire. Some scholars see the Fourth Crusade as an early example of the West's attempt to shape the East in line with its own values. According to this perspective, the establishment of the Latin Empire and the subjugation of the Orthodox world to the West is like a harbinger of the colonial era. in the following centuries. Today, dear friends, the Fourth Crusade holds many lessons for both the Western and Eastern worlds. For the Orthodox world, it is remembered as a bitter symbol of Western betrayal. Relations between the churches were not restored for centuries after this event, and mutual distrust deeply affected the Christian world. The Western world, on the other hand, sees the Fourth Crusade as a moral collapse and a deviation from idealism. The fact that this crusade showed how the West used a sacred concept like the Crusades for its own interests has led to much criticism. Even today, the Fourth Crusade is considered one of the greatest strategic and moral blunders in history. My dear friends, as you listen to this story, always keep this question in mind. Does the narrative of the Fourth Crusade teach us only about the past, or is it also a lesson for today and tomorrow? How can power and ambition lead human beings astray and destroy their ideals? But wait, it is not over yet. After this trauma to Byzantium, how would the course of history change? As the Ottoman Empire came on the scene, Constantinople would once again be put to the test of fate. And how would history be written this time? In the next episode, we will look for the answers to these questions. Get ready, we will continue to open the golden doors of history together. My dear friends, here we have come to the end of another journey. Today, we examine together the deep traces that the Crusades left on human history. From the fall of Constantinople to the rupture of the Orthodox and Catholic worlds. From the dusty roads of the battlefields to the dark ambitions of kings and leaders. In each case, we saw once again that the past is not only history, but also a guide that sheds light on the present. Let us pause for a moment to reflect. What we hear is not only the story of victories or defeats, but also a mirror of human passions, ambitions, beliefs, and mistakes. The Fourth Crusade tells us not only of the destruction of a city, but also of how promises made in the name of unity can fail. How actions taken in the name of holiness can become corrupt. And my friends, there is a lesson in these stories for all of us. Remember that history is not just a tale written by kings and emperors. It is also the story of the peasant, the merchant, the cleric, and the warrior. It is in each of these stories that we find our part. I hope that what we have told today will be more than just information, but will touch you like an experience, because, my friends, history is not only read to understand the past, but also to build the future more consciously. But this journey does not end here. No, my dear friends, there are many more secrets to discover on the endless roads of history. At the next stops, we will witness the rise and fall of another crusade. In our next story, perhaps we will hear the echoes of a battle on the roads to Jerusalem. Perhaps we will witness the birth of a new holy movement in the heart of Europe. But I wonder, which story do you think will be next? Will we embark on a new search for hope on the rough roads of the Crusades? Or will we reach another turning point in Europe itself? Well, my dear friends, we will find the answer to this question together in the next video. Thank you for tuning in and joining us on this passionate journey through history. If these stories have touched your soul, don't forget to share these whispers of history with others. Until next time, take care and keep listening to the voices of the past. Goodbye.